The thing about Pokemon is that it doesn't look like what it is. From the outside, from the merchandise, the animated series, the trading cards your cousin wouldn't let you touch, it looks like a cheerful franchise about a boy and his electric mouse going on adventures. And it is that. Genuinely. That part's accurate. But underneath all of it, if you actually read the books on the shelves and talk to the right characters and sit with what the Pokédex is quietly telling you between the lines, there's something considerably stranger going on. Pokemon launched in Japan in 1996. 2 games, Red and Green. The concept was simple enough. A kid from a small town goes out into tall grass, catches creatures, battles them, becomes a champion. That's the whole pitch. And it worked, obviously. It's the highest grossing media franchise in history now, which still doesn't quite land when you say it out loud. Bigger than Star Wars, bigger than the MCU, started with a boy walking into some grass in a fictional Japanese town. But we're not here for the business story tonight. We're here because somewhere along the way, across 9 generations of games and an enormous amount of supplementary material, Pokemon quietly developed a genuine cosmology, a creation myth, a god that hatched from an egg in primordial chaos, ancient wars that left permanent scars on the geography of the world, ghost-type Pokemon with Pokédex entries that are genuinely quite disturbing if you read them slowly, a king who built a weapon of mass destruction because his Pokemon died in a war, and he simply could not bear it. A child raised in isolation to become a puppet who became a person instead. None of this is on the merchandise. Most of it lives in books that players walk straight past, or entries in a Pokédex that nobody sits down to read carefully, or background details in games from 15 odd years ago that only connect to something else once you've played through 3 sequels. That's what tonight is, a slow walk through all of that. No particular rush, just a long, comfortable wander through one of the most unexpectedly deep fictional worlds in the history of games. If you want to sleep good, this is a good one for that. In Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, released in 2006 for the Nintendo DS, there's a library in a city called Canalave. It's a building you visit briefly for story reasons partway through the game, and then most players never go back to it. You get what you need, you leave, you carry on catching things. Standard. But if you do go back and actually read the books on the shelves, really read them, not just skim, there's a creation myth in there. A full one. Just sitting on library shelves that the vast majority of players walked straight past, written like a document from a region's ancient texts. No fanfare, no dramatic music cue, just books in a building. The creation myth in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl is often associated with Arceus and the Canalave Library, but the in-game book actually titled Sinnoh's Myth is about the Lake Guardians instead. Before the universe existed, before there was anything at all, there was a vortex of chaos. Everything that would eventually become matter, energy, time and space was tangled together in a formless, swirling blur. No order, no structure, just chaos moving on itself. The myth doesn't explain how long this went on, or whether how long is even a meaningful question when time doesn't exist yet. It just says, chaos, that was the state of things. And then an egg appeared. Nobody explains why. The myth doesn't offer a reason. The chaos was churning, and then there was an egg in the middle of it. And that's simply that. Which, if you think about it, is not so different from how a lot of real-world creation myths handle the same problem. The Orphic egg in Greek mythology. The world egg in Vedic tradition. The cosmic egg as the origin of everything is one of those images that crops up independently across cultures because it's a satisfying answer to an unanswerable question. Something contained, something waiting to hatch. The universe as a thing that began when a boundary broke open. From this egg hatched Arceus, the original one, the first thing in existence. Pokemon number 493 in the National Pokédex. It looks, honestly, a bit like a horse wearing a golden halo and some sort of decorative wheel around its torso. It's normal type, which is either a knowing joke on Game Freak's part or the deepest type assignment in the entire franchise, depending on how charitable you're feeling. The name comes from archeus, an old alchemical concept referring to the vital force that gives matter its form and direction. The life principle. The thing that makes a thing what it is rather than something else. Whether that was the specific inspiration is not confirmed, but it fits neatly enough that it's hard to imagine it was accidental. Arceus is described in its Pokédex entries as having created the universe with 1,000 arms. Arceus does not visibly have 1,000 arms. The accepted reading is that the 1,000 arms are a poetic description of the energy Arceus expended in the act of creation. Not literal limbs, but a way of expressing something that doesn't have a better language. The franchise borrows that kind of mythological shorthand quite naturally. A 1,000-armed creator figure appears in Hindu and Buddhist traditions as an expression of infinite reach and action. The number 1,000 meaning not exactly 1,000, but more than can be counted, more than can be grasped. What Arceus does first in the myth is create 3 beings from itself. Dialga, the Pokémon of time. A steel-blue dragon-like creature whose heartbeat is supposedly the mechanism that keeps time moving. The Pokédex entry in Diamond says time began moving when Dialga was born, which raises the question of what Arceus was doing before that, existing in the timeless period after hatching, but before creating time. But the myth doesn't linger on that, and neither should we. Palkia, the Pokémon of space, a pale pearl-coloured creature that governs the fabric of where things exist, where space expands and contracts, how the physical dimensions of reality arrange themselves. And Giratina, the Pokémon of antimatter. We'll come back to Giratina at proper length because its story is worth taking slowly and on its own terms. These 3 together form the structural skeleton of reality, time, space, and the antimatter that exists in opposition to everything else. The franchise is drawing on actual particle physics here. Antimatter is real, a genuine scientific concept, particles that mirror ordinary matter and annihilate on contact with it. The fact that a Pokémon game has a legendary trio built around the time-space antimatter triad of physics is not something Game Freak made a great deal of noise about. It's just quietly there. Then came the Lake Guardians. Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf are 3 small floating psychic-type Pokémon who live in the 3 major lakes of the Sinnoh region. Easy to overlook as significant if you're just trying to progress through the game, but in the creation myth, they're essential. Arceus created them to give the conscious creatures of the world the capacity to feel and understand. Uxie brings knowledge, Mesprit brings emotion, Azelf brings willpower. Without them, the argument goes, nothing in the world would know anything, feel anything, or have the will to do anything with what it knows and feels. I find this one quite affecting as a detail. The idea that consciousness, the capacity for inner experience, was a deliberate act of creation. That someone decided the living things of the world should be able to know and feel and choose. Most games don't think about that at all. The fact that the Pokémon cosmology includes a reason why interiority exists is the kind of thing you find when you actually read the library books. And then there's Regigigas. Regigigas is an enormous Pokémon, a kind of colossal golem who, according to the legends of the Sinnoh region, moved the continents, physically dragged the land masses of the world to where they are now. The geography of the Pokémon world, the shape of the regions, the arrangement of the land was positioned by hand by a single creature moving the earth. This gets mentioned in a couple of in-game texts and then the games carry on, but it's worth sitting with for a moment. The map looks the way it does because someone put it there. Sinnoh itself, in the mythology, was the first land created, which is why so much of the deep cosmological lore is attached to that region specifically. It's not arbitrary, it's explained in universe. The oldest region has the oldest stories. There's a line in one of the Canelav library books that suggests there are other worlds beyond this one, that the process that created this universe created others too. The game was gesturing at a multiverse in 2006, quietly, in a library book, in a way that would only become fully significant a decade or more later when the franchise started to really dig into alternate realities and dimensional travel. Things that looked like world-building flavour at the time turned out to be structural. The part of all this that I keep coming back to is just how quietly it was placed there. No dramatic cutscene, no orchestral swell. A god hatched from an egg in primordial chaos and created time and space and consciousness itself, and the game put that information on library shelves that most players walked past on the way to do something else. Something worth spending a moment on is the sheer strangeness of Dialga's existence as a concept. Time began when Dialga was born. That's a statement that the game makes and then moves on from, but it has an implication that doesn't fully resolve. Arceus existed before time existed. Arceus hatched from an egg, created the conditions of the universe, created Dialga, and then time started. So what was Arceus doing before that? The myth describes it as hatching and then creating, which implies sequence. First this happened, then this happened. But sequence is a property of time, and time didn't exist yet. It's one of those places where mythology runs into the hard edges of logic, and the response historically has always been to not look too closely. Creation myths almost universally have this problem. The moment before creation involves concepts like before and after that only make sense inside a universe where time exists. The Pokemon creation myth has the same honest limitation as the Book of Genesis and most cosmological traditions. It describes a before and an after without quite being able to account for what before means when time isn't running. I find that oddly comforting. It's not a flaw in the Pokemon mythology specifically. It's a property of the problem. Palkia's role is somewhat easier to sit with. Space, the fabric of where things are, is perhaps the more intuitive concept. Palkia governs the dimensions of physical reality, and the fact that it's a Pokemon means it can be in specific places, which is a bit philosophically odd for an entity that governs the concept of place itself. The games never quite address this circularity. Palkia exists somewhere. It governs where things are. That it has a somewhere to exist is presumably something it sorted out early on. In Platinum, Dialga and Palkia are in conflict when they are summoned together at Spear Pillar, and the disturbance caused by their powers is what destabilizes the normal world. Team Galactic's plan involved using their conflict as a power source to try and create a new universe. The idea being that the energy released by two fundamental forces of reality fighting is enormous, and if you could capture and redirect that energy, you could, according to Team Galactic leader Cyrus, unmake and rebuild reality entirely. Remove the messiness of human feeling from it. Cyrus is one of the more genuinely interesting villains the franchise has produced, and his motivation is unusual for a franchise antagonist. He doesn't want power over the world. He doesn't want the world's resources. He thinks the world, as it exists, is fundamentally flawed because it contains emotion. He himself says he removed his own emotion, not through any magical means, but through a long process of deliberate self-modification. He suppressed the parts of himself that felt things, and he believes this made him more rational, more capable, more correct. The fact that wanting to destroy the universe and remake it without feeling is itself an emotionally driven desire. A response to pain, perhaps, rather than its absence, is the gap in his self-understanding that the games don't quite point to directly, but leave visible. He ends up in the distortion world, with Giratina, both of them confined, one voluntarily, having chosen to remain, and one involuntarily, having been placed there at the start of the universe. The symmetry is either intentional or a very good accident. The distortion world is one of those places that stays with you. You visit it in Pokemon Platinum, the expanded version of Diamond and Pearl released in 2008, near the climax of the game. You fall through a rift at the top of Mount Coronet and end up somewhere that doesn't behave like anywhere else. Gravity goes sideways, platforms float at impossible angles, water flows upward. The landscape is a collection of islands suspended in a space with no clear sky, no ground, no consistent rules about which direction is down. It's genuinely disorienting in the way that good alien environments should be. And the game does an unusually good job of making it feel actually wrong, rather than just unusual. This is where Giratina lives. After Arceus created the universe, after Dialga and Palkia were born to govern time and space, after the Lake Guardians were made to give consciousness to living things, there was a problem. Giratina, the third of Arceus's created beings, the Pokemon of antimatter, was violent, destructive. Not malicious exactly, but constitutionally dangerous in a way that posed a genuine problem for a universe still in the process of forming. Here's the physics of it. Antimatter is the mirror of ordinary matter. When the two come into contact, they annihilate each other. Both are destroyed in the collision. For a universe in the process of assembling itself, of matter coalescing into stars and planets, and eventually life, having antimatter loose in the mix is not ideal. The developers of the game have confirmed in interviews that Giratina and the Distortion World are literal personifications of antimatter. This wasn't subtext, it was design intent. So Arceus banished it. Not destroyed, banished, the distinction matters. Arceus made Giratina and then couldn't unmake it, or perhaps chose not to. So the solution was to place it somewhere where the damage it could do was contained. The Distortion World, a dimension that exists on the reverse side of the Pokemon world, where time doesn't flow and space isn't stable, and the rules of the physical universe don't quite apply. The Pokédex entry in Platinum is extraordinarily brief. It was banished for its violence. It silently gazed upon the old world from the Distortion World. That's the whole entry. 2 sentences. And there's something in the phrase, silently gazed upon, that I find quite melancholy. Not raging against confinement. Not plotting, just watching. Looking at the world it was made to help create, from a dimension it can never fully leave. We're here because somewhere along the way, across 10 generations of games and an enormous amount of supplementary material, Pokemon quietly developed a genuine cosmology. One reading of these, which I find elegant, and which is not officially confirmed but sits very comfortably with the material, is that the platforms are Giratina's failed experiments. That over the course of an enormous span of time, since the beginning of the universe, essentially, Giratina has been in this space, trying to figure out how to control its own gravitational forces, and the structures left behind are the attempts that didn't work. The whole landscape is evidence of a very long, very solitary project. Cyrus, the villain of Diamond, Pearl and Platinum, ends up in the Distortion World and remains there after the player defeats Giratina at the climax of the game's story. The game doesn't show his death, it doesn't show his escape. He's simply there, in the dimension outside time, and the scene ends. The player leaves, Cyrus stays. He was a man who wanted to destroy the universe and build a new one without the messiness of spirit and emotion and human feeling. He ended up in a dimension with a dragon who had been confined since the beginning of everything, watching the world from the wrong side of a barrier it didn't choose. What those two got up to, the game leaves entirely to the imagination. I've thought about it a fair amount, and I don't think either of them had a particularly good time. The question of whether Giratina is actually evil is one the franchise handles with more nuance than it initially appears. In Pokemon Legends Arceus, set in ancient Sinnoh, which we'll get to properly later, Giratina functions as a villain of sorts, allied with a character who wants to challenge and destroy Arceus. But after being defeated, something shifts. Giratina doesn't become warm or friendly, exactly, but it changes its orientation. Later in the same game, it seems to be acting to protect the world rather than threaten it. There's a reading of Giratina that isn't about evil at all. It's about a being that was made with a nature it didn't choose, that was dangerous because of what it was rather than what it wanted, and was placed in confinement for the safety of everything else. It didn't misbehave, it existed. The problem was that its existence was incompatible with a functioning universe, and the solution was removal. Whether that's justice is a question the games don't answer, which is, I think, the right call. The distortion world and the Pokemon world are described in the lore as balanced against each other. Both must exist for the other to remain stable. Giratina's prison is also, in some sense, its purpose. The antimatter world couldn't just be left unattended. Giratina governs it, manages it, from exile forever. I don't know. The image of something that was made problematic, not evil, sitting at the edge of everything and keeping watch over the nothing, I find that genuinely affecting in a way that a lot of ostensible children's media doesn't manage. There's a Pokemon in the Sinnoh games called Spiritomb. Spiritomb was created from the imprisonment of 108 evil spirits, bound to a stone called the Odd Key Stone. The number 108 is significant in Buddhist cosmology, the number of earthly temptations that Buddhist monks traditionally strive to overcome, and the number of beads on a Buddhist rosary. Whether this is deliberate on Game Freak's part is, again, unconfirmed. But Sinnoh is a region modelled on the Japanese island of Hokkaido, and the cultural vocabulary of the region's lore draws frequently from Japanese and broader East Asian traditions. A 108 spirit binding being placed in a game about that region is not a random number. Spiritomb doesn't have a weakness in the original games, not one. No type is super effective against it. This was changed in later generations when the fairy type was introduced, giving it a vulnerability. But in its original form, it was an entity constructed from bound evil spirits with no conventional weakness. The implications of this, that some things don't have easy counters, that harm accumulated and compressed doesn't dissolve cleanly, is more interesting than the gameplay required it to be. The distortion world itself has a design quality that I think is worth dwelling on, beyond its role as a prison. The environment responds to the player's movement in ways that the ordinary game world doesn't. Gravity shifts. Paths that would be vertical in normal space are horizontal here. The geometry of the place is internally consistent but externally alien. It follows rules, just not the ones applied anywhere else. This is the most literal representation in the franchise of the idea that different places operate under different principles. Antimatter, which Giratina and the distortion world embody, isn't just matter running in the wrong direction. It's a different set of physical, antimatter is the same set of physical conditions. A visual form that players can walk around in, and the experience of doing so, of having to reorient constantly, to figure out which direction is navigable at each step, translates the concept of a place with different rules into something felt rather than just described. The films expanded the distortion world somewhat. In Giratina and the Sky Warrior, the 11th Pokemon film, released in 2008, the distortion world is shown as a prison not just for Giratina, but as a sensitive system that reflects disruptions in the regular world. Pollution in the physical world manifests as toxic damage in the distortion world. The two worlds are interdependent, and Giratina is described as protecting the distortion world from within its own prison. Keeping watch from the place it was sent to as a punishment, performing a function of care for what it was separated from. The film isn't canon to the games in any strict sense, but the image it provides is compelling and consistent with the game's framing. The entity that was locked away to protect the world is, in the act of being locked away, protecting it. That's a better outcome than most banishments in mythology. While Arceus created the framework of the universe, while Dialga and Palkia were setting time and space in motion, and Giratina was being placed in confinement, the actual physical world was being shaped by something else. Different forces, in a different region, with a different mythology, In Hoenn, the story of creation is fundamentally about a geological argument. Groudon raised the land masses from the ocean. That's what the mythology says. This enormous, continent-sized sea, this enormous, continent-shaping creature of fire and earth expanded the land until the world had ground to stand on. The oceans gave the world its water. Neither of them was made by Arceus directly. They emerged from the primordial world and shaped it, and at some point they collided. The two forces that made the world fought over it. The battle, according to the legend, was catastrophic. The kind of conflict that reshapes coastlines, that raises new mountains from the sea floor, that rearranges the geography of everything. Neither side won. The fight exhausted itself eventually into a standoff, and the standoff became the geography. The land is where it is and the ocean is where it is because two ancient forces fought to a draw and stopped. Rayquaza, meanwhile, has been circling the upper atmosphere since before any of this was recorded. It lives in the ozone layer, specifically in it, as its habitat, in the stratosphere where the air thins out and the sky starts looking more like space. Its entire purpose seems to be mediation. When Groudon and Kyogre fight, Rayquaza appears and puts a stop to it, not by taking sides, not by defeating either of them, just by being powerful enough and authoritative enough that the fighting stops. It's been doing this for an unspecified but clearly enormous amount of time. Nobody asked it to, it just does. In Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, the remakes of the Hoenn games, released in 2014, there's the concept of primal reversion. Groudon and Kyogre, when they access their primal forms, are described as returning to their ancient, unconstrained selves, not transforming into something new, reverting to what they always were before the world settled. The implication being that the normal versions you encounter in the games are actually the contained post-conflict states of these beings, calmer versions, worn down by ages of not fighting. The raw forms, the truly primordial ones, are what you get when someone wakes them up properly. This is a detail that sits oddly once you notice it. The normal-looking legendary Pokémon are already the reduced version. Team Magma and Team Aqua, the two villainous groups in the Hoenn games, want to awaken Groudon and Kyogre respectively. Team Magma wants to expand the land to give more room for human civilization. Team Aqua wants to expand the sea because ancient Pokémon evolved in the ocean, and land is an imposition on the natural state of things. Both groups are presented as sincere. Both have an internally coherent ideology. Both are also catastrophically wrong about what they're actually dealing with, because neither of them fully understands that the beings they want to awaken were the forces that shaped the continents in the first place, and waking them up risks starting the original argument again from scratch. There's a Pokémon called Relicanth in the Hoenn games, a deep-sea Pokémon that survived unchanged for 100 million years. Unchanged. 100 million. It's just there in the ocean, ancient, mostly being ignored. The Pokémon world has that kind of deep time running through it, not just thousands of years, but millions, hundreds of millions, back to geological formation. It doesn't dwell on it, but it's in there. A detail I like, Rayquaza doesn't seem to live anywhere in particular. It doesn't have a cave, it doesn't have a hidden location. You encounter it at the top of the sky pillar, which is just a very tall building. The implication seems to be that it's always up there, somewhere in the atmosphere, invisible and present, circling the planet indefinitely and waiting for the next time it's needed. The caretaker of the sky that nobody knows exists. The relationship between the Hoenn cosmology and the Sinnoh cosmology is not directly addressed in the games. They exist in the same world, but seem to describe different layers of it. Arceus made the universe, but Kyogre and Groudon made the specific physical world, or at least the part of it that Hoenn occupies. Whether Arceus created those two, or whether they emerged independently from the primordial world Arceus set in motion, the games leave genuinely ambiguous, which might be the most realistic thing about the whole thing. Real cosmologies from real cultures tend to have that same layered quality, where different stories handle different levels of the same reality without quite resolving against each other. Something to say about Hoenn's relationship with human civilization and technological development that the games touch on but don't emphasize. The Devon Corporation, which is one of the major institutions of the Hoenn region, is a large tech company that manufactures Pokeballs, communication devices, and various technologies used by trainers. It has a research division that clearly operates at a level of sophistication well beyond what the rest of the region's infrastructure suggests. Their products appear across multiple regions. They have contracts with trainers and organizations worldwide. They're also, in various background texts and dialogue, described as researching ancient Pokemon and ancient technologies. One of the items you retrieve for them early in the Hoenn games is a component for something they're building, a component that, eventually, turns out to be connected to a machine for space travel. The Devon Corporation is quietly using the knowledge base of a region built on the legacy of primordial geological forces to develop space program adjacent technology. The context of Hoenn, a region shaped by the ancient conflict between Gruden and Kyogre, where the balance between land and sea is literally the history of the world, and the presence of a major technology corporation doing research at the edge of that understanding is an interesting tension that the games don't fully explore. What does it mean to study the forces that made the world as objects of technological interest? What happens when the understanding of creation myth becomes an engineering resource? The games don't answer this, but the Devon Corporation is still there, doing its research, and the world is still the way Groudon and Kyogre made it. The Weather Trio, the collective term for Groudon, Kyogre, and Rayquaza, are among the most physically powerful Pokemon in the franchise by Pokédex description, and Rayquaza specifically occupies an interesting position among them. It's not a peacemaker in the sense of being neutral or pacifist. Rayquaza is described as territorial and capable of enormous violence. Its role as mediator exists because it's powerful enough that Groudon and Kyogre respond to its presence. It doesn't appeal to their reason. It simply is what it is, and what it is happens to be sufficient to end the fighting. There's a reading of Rayquaza's situation that I find quietly funny, which is that it has been doing this particular job for an unspecified but very long time without any apparent reduction in the need for it. Groudon and Kyogre keep getting awakened by humans, as they did in the original Hoenn games and the remakes. Every time, Rayquaza appears and sorts it out. Every time, everything goes back to more or less how it was. This pattern has presumably repeated across many civilizations' worth of Hoenn history, long before the current games were set. Rayquaza is the most dependable employee in the Pokemon world and has never once been thanked. The Delta episode, which is the post-story content in the Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire remakes, also gives Rayquaza a role in defending the planet from an asteroid, awakening to its full power in response to an existential threat. Its mega evolution is triggered not by a Mega Stone, but by Rayquaza consuming star fragments and channeling the resulting energy. The cosmological scale of Rayquaza's actual function, planet defense, civilization management, geological peacekeeping, is understated by the fact that most players encounter it in a tall building that happens to be called the Sky Pillar. The Pokédex entry for Yamask from Pokemon Black goes like this. Each of them carries a mask that used to be its face when it was human. Sometimes they look at it and cry. That's in a children's game. That's a thing Game Freak decided to put in a children's game, in text that most children would read quickly and move on from. A ghost Pokemon that carries its own former face as a small artifact and grieves over it. The mask it holds isn't a decoration, it's what it looks like when it was a person. The franchise has a particular habit, consistent across its entire history, of burying genuinely unsettling ideas inside Pokemon that look either cute or unthreatening. Ghost types are where this tendency is most concentrated, because ghost types, by their nature in the lore, tend to have something to do with death, and the franchise's relationship with death is considerably more honest than most children's media allows itself to be. Yamask is a good place to start. Dead humans become Yamask. That's the explicit explanation. Not suggested, not theorized, stated. Each one carries the mask of its former face. Each one still has memories of its human life, and sometimes it looks at what it was and cries. There's a follow-up question the game doesn't ask, but the Pokédex effectively forces on you, which is, how did so many people die in ways that produced enough Yamask for them to be a recognizable species? What is the rate of human to Yamask conversion, and under what circumstances does it happen? And is this a thing that Pokemon World citizens know about and simply live with? The games don't go near this, they just leave the entry there. Phantump comes from a generation later, Generation 6, the Kalos games, and its entry in Pokemon Sun says, "These Pokemon are stumps possessed by the spirits of children who died in the forest. Their cries sound like eerie screams." So that's a tree stump possessed by the ghost of a dead child. Good. And then there's the additional detail present in other entries, that Phantump can imitate the voices of children in order to lure other children into the forest. The implication being that the woods where Phantump live have a kind of self-perpetuating haunting mechanism. Children die there, become Phantump, and the resulting Phantump call out with children's voices to draw more children in. Whether this is intentional on Phantump's part, whether they want company, or whether it's just an instinct, the game clarifies, and painy apparently, which is very sweet and also genuinely quite concerning. Gengar's entry in Pokemon Sun is one of the ones that breaks the fourth wall in a way that always gets me. Should you feel yourself attacked by a sudden chill, it is evidence of an approaching Gengar. There is no escaping it. Give up. The Pokédex is addressing you directly. The researcher who wrote this entry has apparently decided that the most useful information to provide about Gengar is not its habitat or behaviour, but a direct warning to the reader that if they encounter one, they've already lost. Give up. No point. There is, of course, a point. You fight Gengar all the time. In-players fight Gengar occasionally in the Pokemon games. Gengar. The entry is either wildly exaggerated or the researcher was having a very bad moment, but the tone of it, that casual resignation, that flat give up, is funnier and more unsettling in equal measure. Kadabra has a different kind of darkness to it. Several of its Pokédex entries across the years contain a theory, always described as a theory, never confirmed, that Kadabra was originally a human child with psychic abilities that somehow transformed. The Fire Red entry says, it is rumoured that a boy with psychic abilities suddenly transformed into Kadabra while he was assisting research into extrasensory powers. The Fire Red and Sun entries both return to this idea in slightly different forms. Knows quite what happened. The implication, if you take the repeated references seriously, is that every Kadabra you've ever trained and battled was once a person. The franchise never confirms this. It always stays in the register of rumour and theory, but it keeps coming back to it, across multiple games, and the fact that it keeps coming back to it feels deliberate. Lavender Town is a small village in the Kanto region, the region of the first games. It exists for one reason, the Pokemon Tower, a 7-story building that serves as a graveyard for deceased Pokemon. The town is small and purple, and mostly quiet, and the music that plays there, a simple, slightly unsettling loop, became one of the most talked about pieces of video game music of the 1990s. Not because it's particularly complex, but because it fits the place perfectly. It sounds like somewhere that is trying to be peaceful and not quite managing it. The story that happens in the Pokemon Tower involves Team Rocket, Before you arrive in Lavender Town in the original games, Team Rocket had invaded the tower and was stealing the skulls of Cubona, a small lonely Pokémon that wears the skull of its dead mother as a helmet. One mother Marowak tried to protect her Cubone child. Team Rocket killed her. Her ghost refuses to leave. She stays in the tower, blocking access to the upper floors, where Team Rocket is holding the elderly man who cares for orphaned Pokémon. She appears as an unnamed ghost, who your Pokémon are too frightened to fight. You need a specific item, the Fluidscape, to even see her for what she is. Once you use it, she's revealed. A Marowak, level 30, already dead. Not one you can catch, the Pokéballs don't work on her. She simply has to be defeated, and when she is, her spirit settles, and she can pass on. There's a version of this story in the Let's Go games, released in 2018, where the Cubone child is present when the Fluidscape reveals the ghost. The child calms the mother's spy. The player character calms the mother's spirit directly. She just leaves. I find that one more affecting personally. The image of a mother who died protecting her child, unable to move on until she knew the child was going to be all right, and the resolution being the child's presence rather than a battle. The franchise very rarely does sentiment well. This one, it does. The Marowak ghost in Pokémon is a ground type and a literal ghost, in mechanical sense of the game, and it's a ghost in the emotional sense, a presence anchored to a place by something unresolved. The tower is full of other ghost-type Pokémon, which can disguise themselves as literal ghosts and are frightening in a more playful, conventional way. But the Marowak is different. She's not a monster, she's a mother. Though having said all that, several of the other ghost-type entries, if taken literally, would make the Pokémon world considerably more haunted than the games themselves depict. Ghosts entering homes, following people through shadows, whispering at night. The actual Pokémon are probably less actively malevolent than advertised. Probably. There's one more piece of ghost-type lore that I want to spend time on because it sits differently from the others. Gengar has a theory attached to it, not in any official capacity, just as a piece of fan reasoning that emerged from a combination of design observation and Pokédex reading, that Gengar is the ghost of a Clefable. The visual similarity between the two silhouettes is notable. Gengar is described in some entries as being formed when a departed spirit lingers in the shadow of another person, which is a somewhat different origin story from the straightforwardly human ghost becomes Pokémon pipeline of Yamask and Phantump. The franchise has never confirmed or denied the Clefable theory, and it probably wasn't the intended reading. What the theory represents is something the franchise invites, which is the attempt to apply genuine zoological and genealogical thinking to creatures that were never strictly designed to withstand it. The Pokédex implies lineages and relationships and origins that, when you try to map them consistently, produce contradictions, which is accurate to how real mythology works and how real biology works. Both are full of relationships that make partial sense, that gesture at patterns without completing them. The case of the ghastly line, ghastly haunter, Gengar, is worth mentioning because it's the original ghost-type line, and the one that set the tone for what ghost types do. Ghastly is described as being composed almost entirely of gas and toxic vapour, with a thin membrane of darkness forming its visible outline. It can pass through walls, it can surround a person entirely and render them unable to move. Haunter has hands that can phase through physical matter and cause paralysis on contact. Gengar is the evolved form that is most solidly physical while remaining able to manipulate shadows and temperature. The progression from formless gas to a creature that occupies space but can still reach through it is an unusual biological arc. Ghost types don't follow the normal rules of Pokémon evolution, where the creature usually becomes larger and more powerful versions of what it already is. The ghastly line becomes progressively more substantial, more physically present. It's moving in the direction of matter. The Unova region introduced a ghost type called Koffa Gregus, which is an evolved form of Yamask. Koffa Gregus is described as absorbing people whole. Its body is a sarcophagus, a golden Egyptian-style coffin, and according to several entries, people who touch it in search of its gold get absorbed into its body and turned into mummies. This is presented as a note of caution, rather than anything the franchise considers particularly alarming, which says something about the normalization of fairly extreme outcomes in the Pokemon world. One more thread about Lavender Town specifically, because the real history of that location is more interesting than the urban legends that grew up around it. The urban legend of Lavender Town Syndrome, the claim that the original Lavender Town music in the Japanese versions of Red and Green caused children to experience headaches, nosebleeds, or worse responses, is exactly that, an urban legend. There are no verified reports of any harm caused by the music. The music is eerie and unusual in a way that sets it apart from the rest of the game's soundtrack, but that's by design. It's doing its atmospheric job. The Syndrome story emerged online in the early days of creepypasta and accumulated detail over many tellings. The actual story of Lavender Town, the in-game story, is already unsettling enough without embellishment. A town built to be a cemetery. Lavender Town is known for its Pokemon cemetery. On stealing the skulls of grieving Pokemon, a murdered mother's ghost, an elderly man held hostage in his own memorial tower. The Pokemon Tower was later converted into a radio station in the Generation 2 games, which takes place several years after Red and Blue, and all the graves were moved underground. The building that was a place of mourning became a place of entertainment. The characters in the game mention this conversion in passing and seem to feel a certain way about it. Lavender Town, in the later games, is quieter, less haunted. Whether that's because the ghosts settled or because there's simply less to mourn there now, the games don't say. On Cinnabar Island, there's a ruined mansion. By the time you reach it in the original games, the building is already derelict. The researchers who worked there are long gone. The wild Pokemon have moved in. The place has the quality of somewhere that was abandoned in a hurry. Doors left open, rooms ransacked, the ordinary objects of a functional research facility now just scattered through a building that no longer functions. Scattered through those rooms, on the floor, and on tables are journal pages. The entries are not in chronological order. You find them as you wander, and you have to piece the sequence together yourself, which the game makes no effort to help you do. The entries in order are these. A Pokemon called Mew was discovered in South America, in a jungle. Researchers studied it. It is described as the ancestor of all Pokemon, the genetic template from which every other species is theoretically derived. From Mew, essentially, everything. The researchers use Mew to create something new. Technically, the entry says Mew gave birth. The precise nature of the process isn't explained in the English version, though the Japanese version implies a single scientist was responsible. What was created was called Mewtwo. Mewtwo was too powerful. The researchers attempted to modify its genetic makeup. Size were not suppressible. The last entry notes this failure, and then stops. What happened next can be inferred from the state of the building. The mansion was destroyed. The researchers are gone. Mewtwo is in Cerulean Cave on the other side of the region, accessible only to trainers who have already defeated the Elite Four and the Champion. The placement is deliberate. The most powerful wild Pokemon you can encounter is found only by those who have already proven themselves the strongest in the region, and it's still significantly harder to deal with than the Champion was. The entry describes years of horrific gene splicing and DNA engineering experiments. The word horrific is doing a lot of work in a Pokédex entry. It's the most overtly judgmental language the game uses about anything that humans have done, and it's used specifically about the process that made Mewtwo. Here's the detail that connects Cinnabar Island to Lavender Town, which are on opposite ends of the region, and which most players don't think of as related. The Cinnabar Research Lab, in the games, is said to have been founded by someone called Dr. Fuji. In Lavender Town, there's a kind man called Mr. Fuji who lives in a small house and cares for orphaned and abandoned Pokemon. He goes to the Pokemon Tower to calm the ghost of the murdered Marowak. He's gentle and kind and clearly has some complicated history that the games never fully surface. For years, the connection between the Dr. Fuji of the Mewtwo journals and the Mr. Fuji of Lavender Town was implicit rather than explicit. The names are the same. The proximity in the story is suggestive. In 2013, the anime miniseries Poin 2013, the anime miniseries Pokemon Origins, a retelling of the original games, strongly implied they are the same person. From Japan, originally, a prologue to the first Pokemon film that gives the full version of the story. Dr. Fuji lost his daughter Amber in a car accident. He became obsessed with the possibility of cloning her, of bringing her back. He joined the Mewtwo project not primarily because he was interested in Mewtwo, but because the cloning technology involved was adjacent to what he needed for his real goal. He also created a clone of Amber, alongside the Mewtwo clone. The Amber clone briefly achieved consciousness. The two clones, Mewtwo and Amber, existed together briefly in the tank, aware of each other. Then Amber's consciousness faded, the clone couldn't sustain it, and Mewtwo was left alone. Its first memory is loss. After Mewtwo destroyed the mansion and left, Dr. Fuji became Mr. Fuji. He moved to Lavender Town and spent the rest of his life looking after Pokemon who had nowhere to go. He made a memorial for his daughter there. He cared for whatever was abandoned. The man who made the thing in the cave became the man who cares for the things nobody wanted. That whole arc lives in background details. None of it is in the main story. It's there if you look. There's a fan theory that I want to mention here as a fan theory. Clearly, not as established lore, but it's one of the more satisfying ones in the franchise. Ditto is a Pokemon that can transform into any other Pokemon. It can learn any move. Genetically, it can use almost any move, certain properties with Mew, specifically the capacity to transform, which Mew also has. In Pokemon Yellow, Ditto can only be found in two locations, the Cinnabar Mansion and Cerulean Cave. Those are the two Mewtwo locations, the places where the experiments happened and where Mewtwo ended up. The theory is that Ditto are Fey. The fan theory states that Ditto are failed Mew clones. This. They've also never denied it. And the geographical distribution, in Yellow specifically, is genuinely suggestive. I don't know what to do with it except enjoy it. Mewtwo in subsequent games is a contradictory presence. Its relationship to memory and its own origin varies depending on which game or film you encounter it in. Sometimes it knows everything, sometimes it knows nothing. The franchise has never committed to a single, definitive, post-Cinnabar Cave version of who Mewtwo is, which is either an oversight or a decision. Given how carefully some of the other lore is managed, I lean toward decision. Mewtwo works partly because it remains unresolved, a made thing that doesn't know fully what to make of its own madeness. The Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island was destroyed in the eruption of the Cinnabar Island volcano, sometime between the events of the original Kanto games and the Gold and Silver games, set a few years later. By the time you return to Cinnabar in Generation 2, the island has changed entirely. The volcano erupted, the gym is gone, the Pokemon Center has been moved to the dock. A researcher comments that the island has been altered beyond recognition. The ruins of the mansion are no longer accessible. Whatever was left of the journals, whatever remained of the laboratory, and the glass tanks in the basement, is buried under volcanic rock. There's something in that, the evidence of what was done there, being covered over by a natural event that didn't need to be anything other than a natural event, but which functions in the narrative as a kind of closure. The place where Mewtwo was made doesn't exist anymore. The records of the process are destroyed. The researcher who did it lives in a house in Lavender Town and doesn't talk about it. The Cerulean Cave, where Mewtwo the Cerulean Cave, where Mewtwo lives, is described across several games as being a dangerous maze filled with very powerful Pokémon, and its layout even changes between different versions of the games. Game, not just updated for the remake, but described in-universe as a place that doesn't stay the same. Things shift there. The cave moves. It's an environment that Mewtwo's presence has made unstable in some fundamental sense. The Pokémon Go Mewtwo encounter, which is not canon to the games in any strict sense, presents a version of Mewtwo in a research lab, which connects to the Cinnabar origin in the way the mobile game's narrative gestures at the main series. The immersive experience events. The immersive experience events tied to Pokémon Go have occasionally featured Mewtwo as a powerful raid and research encounter, but without giving it a distinct voice, personality, or set of motivations beyond what the games establish. All its appearances is genuinely multiple, not just unresolved, but actually different depending on who encountered it and in what format. In Pokémon Let's Go, Pikachu and Let's Go, Eevee, the 2018 remakes of the Kanto games, designed as a more accessible entry point for new players, Blaine the gym leader mentions that he used to work with someone on the Cinnabar research project. He references old research notes, speaks about the subject with a combination of professional interest and something that reads as guilt. He doesn't say much. He doesn't need to. The guilt is in how briefly he moves past it. The manga series Pokémon Adventures, which tells its own version of the Pokémon world in a substantially darker register than the games, fills in several blanks that the games leave open. In that continuity, Blaine contributed his own DNA to the Mewtwo project when insufficient genetic material from Mew was available to complete the project. The result was a Mewtwo with a partial cellular link to a living human, which created problems, eventually, when Mewtwo and Blaine were both going through simultaneous deterioration because of that link. That's not game canon, but it's a version of the story that the manga told, and it sits alongside the game version as another angle on the same source material. What all of the Mewtwo variants share, games, anime, manga, films, mobile, is a fundamental quality of rupture, a thing that was made rather than born, a thing that knows it was made. The various ways it deals with that knowledge are the different characterizations. The knowledge itself is the constant. Throughout Pokémon X and Y, you keep encountering a man called Aze. He appears in various towns across the Kalos region. He's enormous, well over 3 meters tall, a physical detail the games call attention to without fully explaining. He's quiet. He wanders. He doesn't say much about himself. The game initially implies through dialogue from other characters that he might be a descendant of someone historically significant. It's a reasonable assumption. He's not. He's the original. Az was the king of Kalos 3,000 years ago. He received a Flute, a small fairy-type Pokémon, as a gift from his mother before she died. It was the thing that mattered most to him in the world. A small creature that floated alongside him, holding a flower. It sounds slight, and then you sit with what happens next. A war broke out in Kalos. The exact nature of the conflict, who the parties were, what they were fighting over, the games are vague about. What matters to the story is that Az's Floette was conscripted, taken from him by soldiers and sent to fight. Wars in the Pokémon world do use Pokémon. They always have, and Floette was not exceptional, not powerful enough to survive, not strong enough to come back from whatever the battle asked of her. Years after the war started, a coffin arrived. Her flower was inside. Az built a machine. What the machine could do was draw life energy from Pokémon and convert it into restorative force. The process of building it required him to drain the life energy of a large number of Pokémon, which he did, and the machine worked. Floette came back. He revived her, and in doing so, inadvertently, made both of them immortal. The excess life energy extended both their lifespans indefinitely. But grief, it turns out, is not satisfied by getting the thing back. Az still had the rage of the war inside him. His Floette died because people were fighting, and they were still fighting, and the war was still going. So he modified the machine, turned the restorative engine into a weapon, a massive one. He pointed it at the conflict and fired. Both sides were destroyed. The war ended, and Floette left him. She came back to life to find that her existence had cost the lives of countless other Pokemon, that the energy used to revive her had been taken from others, and that the weapon that ended the war had ended it by ending a great many people and Pokemon along with it. She couldn't stay. She couldn't reconcile who she'd been to him with what had been done in her name. Azid has been wandering the world ever since, all that time. He has been in Hoenn, in Galar, presumably many other places across the centuries. He doesn't age normally. The immortality is still working, but he does age, slowly. By the time you meet him in X and Y, he walks with the weight of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time, which is both metaphor and literal fact. You battle him at the end of the game, after you become champion. He wants to find out what a trainer really is, what the bond between person and Pokemon actually means. In practice, the battle ends. He smiles for the first time in the game, and then a sparkle appears in the sky. Floette comes back to him. 3,000 years after she left, she comes back. The game does not over-explain this moment, it just shows it. AZ standing there, and a small fairy Pokemon descending from the sky, and the reunion happening without dialogue. It's the best moment in that particular game, and I would argue one of the better moments in the franchise, because it earns the emotion through the history rather than the sentiment. Now the collateral. The firing of the ultimate weapon had effects beyond the war it ended. Professor Sycamore in X and Y theorizes it's presented as a theory, clearly, that the energy released by the weapon is what created megastones. Ordinary rocks, warped by the X special stones, likely evolutionary stones, warped by the explosive force of the weapon's discharge, which can enable a specific form of transformation in certain Pokemon. Lucian in Generation 6, which was a major gameplay system, not a footnote, is in this reading a side effect of one Grieving King's weapon. The battles you fight using Mega Evolution are, in some indirect sense, a consequence of the Kalos War. And then there's Galar. In Pokemon Sword and Shield, the game set in a region clearly inspired by Great Britain. The history of the Galar region includes an event called the Darkest Day, a black storm that covered the RA Black Storm that covered the region at roughly the same point in history. To enormous sizes, going on rampages, two legendary wolf, Pokemon Zacian and Zamazenta, fought to contain it, helped by two young people who would later be crowned as the kings of the region. That time period overlaps with the Kalos War and the ultimate weapon. Whether these events are directly connected is never confirmed. AZ does appear briefly in lore. AZ does appear briefly in lore connected to Sword and Shield, with later material suggesting he was one of the people who witnessed the darkest day in Galardux. He always was, and whatever the darkest day was, he saw it. The darkest day was caused by Eternatus, an alien Pokemon that arrived in the Galar region inside a meteor roughly 20,000 years before the events of Sword and Shield. When it woke up, it tried to absorb all available energy to sustain itself. The byproduct of that energy absorption spread outward as particles that caused wild Pokemon to grow enormous. Zacian and Zamazenta sealed Eternatus away and were promptly forgotten by history. The actual events were eventually replaced in the popular memory by a simplified story about human heroes with a sword and a shield. What happened to Zacian and Zamazenta after the sealing is that they went to rest in a forest and became stone. They stayed there until Eternatus was awakened again, thousands of years later, by a well-meaning corporate chairman who had discovered the sealed entity underground and thought he could use its energy to solve an energy crisis that wouldn't arrive for another 1,000 years. He was doing it for future generations. He was also about to destroy the present generation. The games present this without much judgment, which is interesting in itself. The villain of Sword and Shield is not malicious in any conventional way. He's a technocrat who made a terrible calculation and went too far. There's something in the Kalos Galar constellation of stories, the wars, the weapons, the things sealed underground by sacrifice, that feels like the franchise working through a particular kind of historical anxiety. The idea that history is full of disasters that were narrowly avoided, that the world is preserved by things that got forgotten, that the past has consequences stretching forward across thousands of years, whether anyone knows about them or not. The statues of the two kings who helped Zacian and Zamazenta during the darkest day, were hidden behind a mural that was later destroyed. The legend. The version that survived was the one where humans did it alone. The gap between what the statues actually showed and what history recorded is visible in the game if you know where to look. It's a small detail and the game doesn't linger on it, but it's there. The specific geography of where the ultimate weapon was buried after the Kalos War is a detail that sits quietly in the world building. Az's brother, who appears in the background of the X and Y story, but never as a significant presence, was reportedly disgusted by what had been done. He helped bury the weapon deep underground in the area of Geosenge town, ensuring it couldn't be easily accessed. The town was built more or less on top of its burial site. 3,000 years later, the game's villain Lysandre, who considers himself a visionary and is, among other things, a direct descendant of that brother, activates the weapon again. He has the activation key. He has the resources. He believes he's doing something necessary, culling the population of the world to preserve its beauty and resources for a smaller number of people who deserve them. It's a philosophy with a family resemblance to Cyrus's desire to unmake emotion and to various real-world ideologies that the franchise is clearly aware of, but handles without being didactic about. What's interesting about Lysandre is that he began as someone who genuinely tried to help. His backstory, revealed through NPC dialogue, and the Holocaster network, is of someone who observed the world's problems clearly and tried to solve them through charitable work and enterprise, became exhausted and disillusioned by the impossibility of the problem, and resolved it by deciding the problem was the population rather than the distribution. The descent from sincere humanitarian to someone willing to destroy the world to save it is traced in background material rather than in the main narrative. But it's there. He fails. The weapon fires incompletely. The player stops it. Lysandre's fate at the end of X and Y is ambiguous. The building collapses, and the game doesn't confirm his survival. A detail in the post-game suggests he may have been affected by the weapon's energy in the same way AZ was, that there might be another wanderer somewhere. The games don't confirm this. The question of why Lysandre had the weapon's activation key, when it was AZ's weapon, AZ was imprisoned in Lysandre's labs, and AZ clearly didn't give it willingly, is one of those loose threads the games leave without a clean answer. Some things in the lore are just gaps. Not every gap is intentional mystery. Some are just gaps. AZ, after you free him from the labs, is not present for the final events of X and Y, but doesn't intervene directly. His exact situation, but the shape of it? Someone trying to use the weapon almost being used, the world almost ending, and then not. He wandered through enough history to have pattern matched it. He watches, and after the player saves the region, he appears at the parade to fight them, and Flute comes back. The personal in the cosmic is what those games do best. The scale of the destruction AZ caused, and the scale of the reunion that ended millennia of consequence, are both enormous. And both are just about one person and one small Pokemon and a flower. There's a room in Team Plasma's castle near the end of Pokemon Black and White that the player finds after most of the story is resolved. It's a large room. It's full of toys and spinning wheels, and a chessboard floor, and the architecture of a childhood that was kept sealed off from the world. It's N's room, He grew up in there. Team Plasma is the villainous organisation of the Unova games, and their stated cause is the liberation of Pokemon from human control. Their public argument, delivered early in the game by a man called Getsis in a plaza, is worth taking seriously on its own terms. He says, most of us believe that humans and Pokemon are partners who've come to live together because they want and need each other. But is that really true? Is it actually the case that a Pokemon in a Pokeball is there by choice? Or have we just told ourselves that story because it's more comfortable than the alternative? It's a genuinely reasonable question. The franchise had been running for over a decade before Black and White asked it directly, and the fact that it did is part of why those games are held in unusually high regard. N is Team Plasma's king. He's the one who will awaken the legendary dragon of Unova, stand before the Pokemon League, and use the authority of a legendary Pokemon to demand that everyone release their Pokemon. He's the figurehead of the movement, and he believes in it completely, without any concealment or performance. He talks about Pokemon in a way that's different from how other characters talk about Pokemon. Not strategically, not competitively, but as if he actually understands something about what they experience. He can hear Pokemon. That's presented as a literal ability. When you first encounter him in the early game, he tells you what your own Pokemon are feeling. Not performing, receiving. The room explains how this happened. Getsis, N's adoptive father, raised him in isolation, in a room, surrounded exclusively by Pokemon who had been abused and neglected by people. The entire sample of human-Pokemon relationships that N was exposed to across his entire childhood was curated to produce a specific conclusion. Every Pokemon he ever met had been hurt. Of course, he concluded that humans hurt Pokemon. He had never been allowed to see anything else. Getsis needed a king who genuinely believed in liberation. Not a puppet mouthing words, but a true believer, because true believers are persuasive in ways that performers aren't. N's sincerity was weaponized. His genuine distress on behalf of suffering Pokemon was the mechanism by which Getsis planned to achieve something that had nothing to do with Pokemon liberation at all. What Getsis actually wanted was to be the only person in the world with the ability to use Pokemon. Everyone else would release theirs. He would keep his. He would have absolute power because power in the Pokemon world runs through Pokemon. The Unova region has 2 legenda. The Unova region has 3 legendary dragons, Reshiram, Zekrom, and Kyurem, respectively. The mythology of the region says they were once a single dragon, belonging to 2 brothers who ruled Unova together until they disagreed about the nature of right action. One sought truth, the literal reality of things as they are. One sought ideals, the vision of what things should become. The dragons split, each brother got half of it. They fought to a standstill, and the conflict exhausted both sides. There's a third part of this mythology, introduced in the sequel games Black 2 and White 2, which concerns Kyurem. Kyurem is what was left behind when the original dragon split. The husk, the void, the part of the dragon that was neither truth nor ideal, just the space between them, the emptiness where the original whole used to be. It's one of the better pieces of symbolic design in the franchise, a dragon made of nothing, representing the absence created when certainty divided against itself. Getsis, by the end of the sequel games, has made contact with Kyurem. His plan by that point has abandoned any pretense of ideology. He just wants to use Kyurem to freeze the world and take it for himself. He fails, he's defeated, and the scene where he's finally cornered is unexpectedly quite difficult to watch. He screams, he loses coherence. He used a child, a specific child, whom he deliberately shaped, who grew into a person capable of genuine moral reasoning that transcended the shaping, and it didn't work. N became a person. Getsis cannot process this. The breakdown isn't played for triumph. It's just a man falling apart because the thing he built failed. and the thing he built was another human being. N, at the end of Black and White, goes north, as far from the Unova region as the map allows. He leaves on his legendary dragon, Reshiram or Zekrom, depending on which version you played, and the game ends. In the sequel, he's somewhere in the far north. He's fine, roughly. He has a conversation with the new player character that touches on what he's been thinking about. He hasn't resolved anything, he's just living with the question. There's a moment early in Black and White where you and N are on a Ferris wheel together. It's the middle of the day. He tells you he's the leader of Team Plasma. He says it calmly, as if it's simply information. He asks you a question about whether your Pokemon are happy. It's a genuinely odd scene because nothing about it is antagonistic. It's two young people on a carnival ride, one of them carrying a belief the other doesn't share, having a conversation. The scene works because N's sincerity is palpable. He's not posturing, he's asking. The fact that what he's asking was shaped by a deliberate program of emotional manipulation doesn't make the question less real. Both things are true. N was built to have this conversation, and N is genuinely having it. The Unova games are the point in the franchise where it started taking its own premise seriously as an ethical question, and I think that's still worth acknowledging. The mythology of the Unova region has a texture to it that the other regions' mythologies don't quite have, and I think it's because Black and White are the games most explicitly concerned with the relationship between history and the present. There are statues throughout the Unova region of the two heroes who wielded the dragons in the founding of the region. They look exactly like the player characters of the game. This is not coincidence. The legend and the present are in a deliberate echo relationship. The franchise has done this before, in a different way with the Sinnoh mythology, but in Unova, it's more overt. The cycle of truth and ideals requires champions in each generation, and the champion of this generation is you. That framing sounds grandiose, and in lesser hands, it would be. What makes it work in Black and White is that N's challenge, the question of whether humans and Pokemon are genuinely partners, or whether we've just convinced ourselves they are, doesn't get answered by the legend. The legend doesn't resolve whether the original heroes were right. It just says they had the dragons. The rightness or wrongness of the relationship is left to the present. The 7 sages of Team Plasma are, as a group, a more interesting set of characters than the franchise usually gives to secondary villain roles. They don't share Ghetsis' motives. Most of them genuinely believe in Pokemon liberation as a moral cause. When the truth about Ghetsis emerges, that the entire organization was built around a lie, that the liberation ideology was a mechanism, some of them continue to follow N's actual ideals rather than Ghetsis'. In the sequel games, there's a splinter group of Team Plasma still operating, still working toward genuine Pokemon welfare under the leadership of a sage called Rude. They've abandoned the theatrics and the self-righteousness and are just quietly doing the thing they originally said they were doing. That's an unusually complicated outcome for a Pokemon villain organization. Most of them just dissolve when the leader is defeated. Team Plasma splits into the ones who are in it for the idea, and the ones who are in it for the power, and the ones who are in it for the idea keep going. Anthea and Concordia are 2 characters associated with Team Plasma who were responsible for N's care when he was young. They're not his parents, Ghetsis is his adoptive father, but they raised him in many of the practical ways that mattered. They appear briefly in the original games, and more significantly in the sequel. And in both appearances they carry a palpable guilt about what was done to N using their hands under their watch, while they were too committed to the ideology to see clearly what was happening to the child in their care. The architecture of N's abuse is specific in a way that makes it more uncomfortable than the vague, bad childhood that many franchise villains are given. It wasn't neglect, it was design. He was given affection, given care, given a room full of toys and a family of sorts, and all of it was oriented toward a single end that had nothing to do with his well-being. The people who cared for him did care for him. in their way, and they also used him. Both things were true at once, which is a more honest version of how harm often works than most children's entertainment manages. N's arc in Black 2 and White 2, which takes place 2 years later, is brief but well handled. He has been living in the north, in a castle ruin, with wild Pokemon. He has been thinking. When the new protagonist encounters him, he's quieter, more grounded, less certain but less fractured. He can acknowledge that his view of the world was distorted without fully abandoning the question that drove it. He's doing what people do after a significant disillusionment, which is figure out what they actually believe under the thing they were told to believe. The game doesn't give him a tidy resolution. He's still working it out. That's fine. The Ultra Beasts look wrong, not wrong in a design failure sense, they're clearly intentional. But if you put them next to any other Pokemon, something is immediately different. They have a visual language that doesn't belong with the rest of the franchise. Angles that aren't quite right. Structures that don't correspond to anything in recognizable biology. They look like things that arrived from somewhere with different rules. That's the point. The director of Pokemon Sun and Moon, Shigeru Ofmori, said in an interview that Ultra Beasts were conceptually based on invasive species, organisms that arrive in an environment where they don't belong and cause disruption, not out of malice, but simply by existing. They're not trying to cause problems. They're just here from somewhere else, and here doesn't know what to do with them, and neither do they. Ultra space is the dimension beyond the Pokemon world, accessible through ruptures called ultra wormholes. It's not a single place, it's more like the space between places, the space between dimensions. The Ultra Beasts come from various locations within or adjacent to Ultra space, and each species comes from somewhere different, with its own ecology and logic. Nihilego is one of the first Ultra Beasts introduced in Sun and Moon. It looks like a jellyfish. Its toxins, according to the Pokédex, can infect a host and induce a state of overwhelming euphoria and possessiveness, a condition where the host loses themselves in the feeling of being powerful, of having found something essential, and acts with total disregard for their own safety and the safety of others in order to protect whatever they've attached to. This is not incidentally relevant to Lusamine. Lusamine is the president of the Ether Foundation, an organization in the Alola region that officially exists to protect Pokemon. She's introduced as brilliant and warm and genuinely committed to the work. She's also been compromised, gradually, by a long exposure to Nihilego's presence, an obsession with the Ultra Beasts that has calcified into something that looks a lot like the toxin-induced state described in the Pokédex entry. She is attached to the Ultra Beasts in a way that overrides her sense of proportion, her care for anyone around her, her ability to be reasoned with. Her daughter Lily has been trying to leave for a long time. Lily is one of the player's companions across Sun and Moon, and what makes her story work is that it's a story about a child getting out. She takes a Pokemon called Cosmog, a small cloud-like creature that can generate ultra wormholes, because she understands that her mother's intentions toward Cosmog are not safe, and getting Cosmog away from her mother is the right thing to do. The Sun and Moon narrative is, underneath the island adventure format and the Pokemon catching, a story about a child escaping a parent whose love has become a form of control. Lusamine eventually fuses with a Nihilego in the climax. The game does not prettify this. She becomes something that looks like her but isn't. Her features elongated, her voice wrong, her care for her children replaced entirely by the toxin-fueled need to possess and protect. She says she loves the Ultra Beasts. She says she loves her children. The word love is doing very different work in those two sentences. Now Necrozma is described in Alolan legend as the Blinding One. The legends of the Alola region say that in ancient times, a Pokemon of pure radiant light visited the islands from ultra space, illuminating the world and bringing life and colour. Eventually, something happened. The light was taken from it, or it gave too much of itself away, or it was damaged in a way the law doesn't specify exactly, and the being of light became a being of darkness, not metaphorically, literally. Its body, which was once pure luminescence, is now black crystalline material. It's described in the Pokédex as a Pokémon in chronic pain, seeking light wherever it can find it and absorbing it, but never able to fully ease the ache. Ultramegalopolis is a city in ultra space, whose residents once worshipped Necrozma as the being that once lit their world. Even now, when it's blinded them, even now, when it has taken all the light from their city and left them in darkness. The city is pitch black. The residents navigate by habit and memory. The tower at the centre of Ultramegalopolis is where Necrozma rested, in the darkness it has created, still not satisfied. What Necrozma needs is light, not in a dramatic or malevolent sense, in a desperate, suffering sense. It's like an entity with a chronic illness that can only be managed by a resource it can't hold on to. The game goes out of its way to make Necrozma pitiable before it makes it a boss. You understand, by the time you face it, that it's not a villain. It's a thing in tremendous pain, doing the only thing it knows how to do. The resolution, in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon specifically, involves giving Necrozma enough light energy voluntarily to restore it to its original Ultra form, which is enormous and brilliant and the form it had before everything went wrong. The moment when it becomes whole again, briefly, is one of the better visual sequences in the franchise, and it's immediately followed by Necrozma deciding that receiving the gift of light freely, rather than taking it, is preferable. One more thread worth noting from the Alola games before we move on: the Ultra wormholes themselves, and what the existence of other dimensions means for the cosmology we've been building. The creation myth in Sinnoh described a universe made from a single egg, governed by time and space and antimatter. The Ultra Space mythology in Alo, the Ultra Space mythology in Alola, suggests that within the structure Arceus created, there are other dimensions, not just alternate versions of the same universe, but genuinely separate spaces with their own ecosystems and histories, de each other, without fully resolving, which is probably accurate to how real mythology works. Different regions, different traditions, different angles on the same reality. The individual Ultra Beasts are worth spending a bit more time on because several of them have lore details that are interesting in isolation. Buzzwole is one of the first ones you encounter in Sun and Moon. It's enormous, a massively muscular, mosquito-like creature. Its Pokédex entry describes it. As an Ultra Beast from another world that loves to show off its grotesquely swollen, unbelievably powerful muscles. Has been absorbing the energy of whatever it encountered there. It looks like something a 12-year-old would design if asked to make the strongest possible thing, which is presumably intentional. It embodies a very particular kind of power, raw physical force, carried to a point of absurdity. Pheromosa is its counterpart. Extremely fast, extremely elegant, described as emitting a pheromone that causes most creatures to react with disgust or, in some interpretations, a pheromone that the creatures of the Pokémon world have simply not evolved to process. Something about its chemistry is foreign enough that the instinctive response is revulsion. It's beautiful, and it makes everything around it uncomfortable. There's a reading of Pheromosa that's about the aesthetics of the uncanny, the thing that looks almost like what you know and produces a stronger wrongness than something that looks nothing like it. Circuitry is a cluster of electrical cables and wiring standing in roughly humanoid configuration, absolutely filled with electrical energy. Every electrical installation. In electrical installations, in an area near a circuitry, may get drained out of malice. It just is a thing that consumes electricity, because that's what it is. Which, genuinely, is one of the stranger things the franchise has produced. The pure indifference of it. The Ether Foundation, in which Lucamine operates, is worth examining as an institution. Its public purpose, protecting and rehabilitating injured Pokémon, is genuine. The Foundation does good work. The employees who appear in the game are largely kind and well-intentioned people working at a facility that does what it says it does. What's happened is that the person at the top of that institution has been compromised, and the institution has been quietly redirected without most of its members knowing. The rank and file of the Ether Foundation are not villains. They work for a villain's project because they work for someone who has become a villain, and the work itself is still good. That's a more realistic picture of how institutions go wrong than the evil organization full of evil people model the earlier Pokémon games tended to use. Team Rocket was full of people doing crime. The Ether Foundation is full of people doing science and care work, while their employer uses the infrastructure for something else. Gladian, Lucamine's son, has B. Gladian. Lucamine's son has been operating as a trainer for hire and carrying an artificial Pokémon called Type Null that the Ether Foundation designed as a weapon, Tortendation. He's 17 roughly, and has been living on his own for some time, working out how to handle the guilt of having left his sister behind and the loyalty that made him take the creature that needed him most. Lily, the sister, is lighter on the surface and considerably more complicated underneath. She doesn't battle. She carries the Cosmog in her bag and talks to it. Her relationship with Pokémon is one of care rather than competition, which the games gently present as equally valid without ever being heavy-handed about it. By the end of Sun and Moon, she's decided to travel, specifically to Kanto, specifically to find a way to help her mother, specifically as someone who is scared and going anyway. The choice to leave is framed as an act of courage for someone who has been protected and sheltered, and the game earns that framing by showing what the protection actually cost her. The warmth of the Ether Foundation, the beauty of the gardens, the care she was surrounded with, all of it existed within a structure that was slowly distorting around the thing at its centre. Getting out required her to see through the warmth. That's harder than getting away from something that was obviously bad from the beginning. In Pokémon Legends Arceus, released in 2022, you arrive from the future. The framing is never really explained to the player's character. You fall through a rift in space. You fall through a rift in space-time, land in ancient Sinnoh, which is called Hisui at this point in its history, and after completing a trial, are recruited into the Galaxy Expedition Team, a group of settlers trying to establish themselves in this unfamiliar land. Is placement as a given and moves on, but it matters. You're from the future. You're walking through the past of a region you might know well from Diamond and Pearl, watching things that haven't happened yet. The Canalave library books you read in 2006 describe events you're now participating in. The first thing that's immediately different in Hisui is the relationship between humans and Pokémon. In every mainline Pokémon game, the baseline assumption is that humans and Pokémon are partners. That's the world you enter. The battles might be competitive, the relationships might vary, but the fundamental state of things is that humans and Pokémon coexist comfortably. They live in towns together. They work together. They've worked things out. In Hisui, they haven't worked things out yet. Pokémon in this setting are dangerous and unpredictable. Most humans are genuinely afraid of them. The Galaxy team's approach, studying Pokémon, documenting them, establishing relationships, is considered by many of the local inhabitants to be eccentric at best and dangerous at worst. The Pokédex you're building isn't a catalogue of a familiar world, it's the first catalogue, the foundation of a relationship that doesn't exist yet. This is doing something interesting. The entire premise of Pokémon, catching and raising and battling creatures, is presented in Legends. Arceus as a historical project. Something that took work to establish. Something that could have gone differently. The noble Pokémon are a particular feature of the Hisui setting. They're Pokemon who have made some form of covenant with the people of their territory, not caught, not trained, but acknowledged and respected. They're treated with something between reverence and careful caution, and the wardens connected to each noble Pokemon maintain the relationship on behalf of their community. The main narrative of Legends, Arceus, involves the noble Pokemon going frenzied. Something is disrupting their relationship with the light of space and time. A rift has opened above Mount Coronet, and whatever is coming through it is destabilizing Pokemon, who are particularly attuned to the balance of things. You have to calm each noble Pokemon by hitting it with calming balms while it attacks you, and then can battle it once it's subdued enough to recognize you. And also an accurate description of managing a large, frightened animal. The character of Volo deserves the most attention. Volo is a merchant you encounter very early in the game. He's friendly, warm, clearly very knowledgeable about the history and mythology of Hisui, and immediately helpful. He gives you useful information. He turns up at convenient moments. He's generous. Over the course of a game that runs 30 to 40 hours, he becomes one of the characters you feel most comfortable around. He is an ancestor of Cynthia, the champion of the Sinnoh games in Diamond and Pearl, who is probably the most famous character in the franchise. Volo has her hair, her bearing, her intellectual quality. The game is letting you notice the family resemblance without making a point of it. The reveal when it comes is that Volo has been using you. He wanted you to collect the Arceus plates, all of them, because he intended to use their combined power to challenge Arceus itself. Not out of standard villainy, out of a very long and very genuine grievance with the way the world is ordered. He believes the world, as Arceus made it, is wrong, or insufficient, or arranged for reasons that prioritize something other than the well-being of the things living in it. He wants to confront the creator and demand an accounting. The betrayal works as a narrative moment because the game has spent its entire running time making you trust him. There's no foreshadowing that screams, "This person will betray you." There are retrospectively visible signs once you know, but on a first playthrough, they read as depth rather than warning. He's been genuine throughout. His grievance is genuine. He's also been deceiving you completely, and the combination of sincerity and deception is what makes the scene land. After you defeat Volo, Giratina appears. He was allied with it, the ancient grudge Giratina carries against its creator finding common cause with a human who carries a similar resentment. You defeat Giratina too, and then something shifts. The game doesn't give Giratina a redemption arc in any sentimental sense, but it changes orientation after this defeat. Later events in Legends, Arceus, if you pursue the post-story content, show Giratina acting in a way that seems to be protective rather than destructive. The grudge doesn't end, but the direction it points changes. The Arceus encounter at the very end of the game, if you assemble the full complement of plates, is handled with unusual restraint for a franchise that often stages its legendary encounters with dramatic music and elaborate cutscenes. Arceus appears. It exists in front of you. The game acknowledges this without making it feel like a climax, which is the right call. A god of the universe showing up should probably feel like something beyond the grammar of boss battles. The game treats it as something beyond that grammar and does so quietly. The thing that Legends Arceus does that I find most valuable, looking at the broader Pokemon lore, is that it grounds the mythology. The creation story from the Canalave library is abstract and old and feels like ancient text. Legends Arceus puts you inside the moment before the myth was even being written. The people of Hisui are living in a world where the relationship between humans and Pokemon is still being negotiated, still being decided, and you are part of that negotiation. The way things are in Diamond and Pearl is not inevitable, it was made. The frenzied, noble storyline in Legends, Arceus does something that's quietly unusual for the franchise, which is give the Pokemon themselves an interior experience that isn't filtered through a trainer's relationship with them. The nobles, while frenzied, are clearly suffering. The frenzied state is described as being overwhelmed by the light from the space-time rift above Mount Coronet, being attuned to something powerful and unable to process it. It's not aggression in the normal sense. It's a state of unbearable excess. Each noble Pokemon has a warden, a human who has a genuine, long-standing relationship with them, and the wardens are visibly distressed by what's happening to their Pokemon. Not because it's an obstacle to progression, but because they care. There are also regional Hisuian forms of familiar Pokemon, and they carry their own lore. Several Pokemon in the region evolve differently from their counterparts elsewhere, because they've been responding to a different environment for a very long time. Hisuian Zoroark is a good example. It's a ghost type, it's a normal ghost type, which is unusual for a species that's normally dark type in Unova Roark family, that had experienced so much suffering that the species' emotional history became embedded in its genetics. Grief and resentment transmitted biologically across generations. That's quietly one of the darker entries in recent Pokemon history, and I find myself thinking about it more than I probably should. The character of Adaman and Irida, the leaders of the two clans in Hisui, who each worship one of the Pokemon of time and space, are an interesting pair because they represent the same fundamental tension that the franchise will eventually dramatize in Diamond and Pearl, but without the villain framing. They disagree about which deity matters more, about how to relate to the powers governing the universe. It's presented as a cultural difference, rather than one being right and one being wrong, and the game is fairly careful to treat both perspectives with respect. The end of Legends, Arceus, if you fully complete it, involves something that doesn't have a parallel in the rest of the franchise. Arceus testing you, not as a boss encounter in the normal sense, more as an evaluation. The specific mechanic is unusual, it's a battle, but the framing of it isn't adversarial. The god of the universe is determining whether you're worth trusting with something, whether the humans of Hisui, through the work you've done, have demonstrated enough to be given a next step. It's a small moment, and the game doesn't overweight it. But the idea that the relationship between humans and Pokemon, which we've seen in this period, is fragile and new and unestablished, passes a threshold because of specific, demonstrated actions. In a specific time frame is quite different from the way most Pokemon games handle the legendary encounter at the end. You didn't just become strong enough to fight it, you became trustworthy enough to be acknowledged by it. The post-credits scene of Legends, Arceus, if you've completed the final encounter, shows a Pokeball in the player's hand. Just a Pokeball, no legendary, nothing dramatic. The game began with you falling into a world where humans and Pokemon couldn't easily coexist, and it ends with you holding one of the objects that in this world's future will define the relationship between them. You were part of how that object came to mean what it means. The history the Canalave library books will eventually describe. You were in it. Spoink must never stop bouncing. The Pokédex entry for Spoink, the small spring-based psychic-type Pokemon from Generation 3, says that it bounces constantly in order to pump its heart. If Spoink stops bouncing, its heart stops. It cannot stop. It is medically required to bounce at all times. What happens when Spoink sleeps? The game does not address this. Spoink is shown sleeping in some promotional material, and the anime. It appears to be asleep. It is not bouncing. By the logic of the Pokédex entry, this is incompatible with survival. The franchise simply doesn't reconcile these two things and carries on. This is a useful entry point for the broader question of what we're supposed to do with Pokédex entries as evidence. The Pokédex is presented in the games as a scientific reference document, an encyclopedia of Pokémon species, their behaviours, their ecological roles. It's ostensibly written by researchers. In the Kanto games, Professor Oak is described as a contributor. In later games, the player thems in later games, the Pokédex itself fills in entries based on the player's encounters. Yes, were, in universe, written by a 10-year-old who had spent perhaps 10 minutes with the creature in question. And it shows. Gengar's entry in Sun, as we covered earlier, ends with "give up," which is not the conclusion a dispassionate researcher would typically put at the end of a scientific description. The entries for several ghost types describe them actively stalking and preying on humans in ways that, if taken literally and simultaneously, would mean the Pokemon world is absolutely saturated with supernatural predators, and everyone is just about it. Slowbro's entries across various games describe the Shelder on its tail slowly feeding on its tail over time. G. Shelder smiles blissfully throughout this process, fully functional and apparently reasonably happy. At what point is the brain eating mentioned? What does consuming its brain mean in practical terms when the creature in question seems fine? The Kangaskhan situation has its own peculiarity. The baby Kangaskhan in its mother's pouch, is it a separate entity that grows up to become an adult Kangaskhan? Or is the baby a permanent fixture, always in the pouch, and you never see a juvenile Kangaskhan because there are no juvenile Kangaskhan, there are only adults with babies? The games seem to point toward the latter, which raises questions about the life cycle of the species that the Pokédex entry simply ignores. There's a Pokemon called Tentacruel, whose entries periodically describe vast, coordinated movements, large groups of Tentacruel moving together in what reads almost like organised behaviour, capable of mass devastation. Some entries describe them gaily, some entries describe them gathering in enormous numbers and driving away all nearby fish. Pokemon.lure of the Pokemon world is home to what amounts to a distributed, semi-military organisation of jellyfish waiting for an unknown signal. Nobody in the game seems particularly worried about this. The academic position on the Pokédex, the reading that makes the franchise internally coherent, is that the entries are unreliable in a specific, understandable way. They're drawn from regional folklore, children's observations, exaggerated local accounts, and the occasional genuine research finding, all mixed together in a document that presents itself as authoritative. The actual Pokemon are probably less dramatically terrible than the entries suggest. The Gengar in your party probably isn't planning your death. The Tentacruel are probably not coordinating. The alternative reading, take it all literally, is more fun and also considerably more alarming. The Pokemon world is a place where Phantump lure children to their deaths, where Gengar follows you home and waits, where vast cephalopod armies circle beneath the waves. A place that has been normalised to the point where nobody mentions these things because they're simply part of the environment. Mimikyu, introduced in Generatio Mimikyu, introduced in Generation 7, wears a Pikachu disguise because it wants to be loved. N. The Pokédex entry for Pokemon Sun notes that a researcher once lifted the disguise to look at what was underneath. The researcher was found dead there. The researcher died from shock after glimpsing under the disguise, per the Pokemon Sun Pokédex, to our mind. The franchise has never shown, or the franchise has only ever briefly shown, what is under Mimikyu's disguise, and has never fully described what it looks like, games and media, and nobody has ever answered that. The Pokédex entry for Moon adds that Mimikyu's Pikachu-shaped costume is stuffed with a shadowy substance, which is not comforting. The franchise doesn't need to answer it. The not knowing is the point. It just wants to be loved. Whatever it actually is, it has wrapped itself in something familiar and hopeful, and the cost of looking behind that is something the games leave entirely at your discretion. I find that a fitting note to approach the end of the night on. The Pokédex problem, the gap between what the entries say and what the games depict, is the franchise admitting quietly that it doesn't fully know what it's made. It started as a small game about a boy and some grass, and it grew into something with a creation myth and 3,000-year wars, and beings of pure light, and the ghost of a murdered mother who couldn't leave until her child was safe. Some of it was planned, some of it accumulated, some of it was placed in library books that nobody was expected to read carefully. It's a strange thing. An enormously successful franchise that, if you look at it from the right angle, is also a genuinely interesting place. Not coherent, not fully resolved, not internally consistent, but interesting. Full of things that got there by routes nobody quite intended, that mean more than they were designed to. There's a lot we haven't touched. The paradox Pokemon, in Scarlet and Violet, ancient past versions and far future versions of the same species somehow existing simultaneously in a crater at the end of the world, and what it means for the nature of time that both are sitting right there in the same field. The mythology of the teal mask and the story of the Loyal Three, which is a regional legend about betrayal and memory. The accumulated strangeness of the Pokemon anime, which has its own separate layer of lore that sometimes overlaps with the games and sometimes departs from them entirely. And there's whatever Pokemon Legends ZA turns out to be. The next Legends game, set in Lu Pokemon Legends, ZA is set in Lumio City, the central hub of the Kalos region. Running a hotel, apparently. All those millennia of wandering, and he's ended up running a hotel with his small fairy Pokemon, which is either the most touching or the most mundane resolution to a millennium-spanning tragedy, depending on your perspective. But that's all for another time. What we've been through tonight, slowly, is the underlying shape of a franchise that started in 1996 as a game about catching animals in tall grass. A god that hatched from a void. 3 beings made to govern time and space, and the physics of antimatter. A lake that holds the reason interiority exists. A burned-down mansion, and the Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island contains burned-down ruins and journals of a Pokemon researcher, our child, and stayed until she knew the child was safe. A king who walked the world for 3,000 years because he couldn't let go, and who eventually did. None of it is tidy, none of it quite resolves. The Pokédex is unreliable, the timelines don't always line up, library books contradict each other. That's fine. Real mythologies are the same way, different traditions, different sources, different answers to the same questions about how things began and why they are what they are. The thing that stays with me, having thought about all of this for an unreasonable amount of time, is how much of it was placed quietly. Not announced, not highlighted, just there, in books on shelves, in Pokédex entries, in the names of research scientists, and the rooms that children grew up in. The franchise built a world with genuine depth, and then mostly got out of the way and let players find it, sleep well,